Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Susan Aglukark, who is an award-winning singer and songwriter from the North, who blends her native Inuktitut language with English in contemporary songs to tell the stories of her people. Over her 30-year career, she's become the artist in residence for Northern Canada, and she's on a mission to inspire and help other Inuk children with her Arctic Rose Foundation. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Valerie.
Given how busy you are, still as an artist, working on memoirs, writing songs, back on tour, children's books, why do you feel it's so important to spend so much of your time giving back to kids in the North?
I remember early in the career, there was quite a few years I feel like I wasted. Not sure of anything really. Am I a singer? Am I a songwriter? Could I be an artist? Could I really do any of this? If I hadn't been in the career, if it hadn't been for the arts, I wouldn't have become who I've become, and I never imagined I could be who I am today. And I want to share that. Our lives in the North, in the Indigenous community, are incredible, beautiful lives, but we know the trauma that's there. We don't have to be the trauma. And if it hadn't been for this, I would not have known that. I would have thought that's perfectly normal and that's the rest of my life. It doesn't have to be. And I know how fortunate I have been that I had these opportunities that brought me to that realization. And that's what I want to share. And that's why it's important through the arts and the artist lens and the artist's experience to share that.
So you're a role model. I mean, when you go north, I mean, we say first Inuk to win the Juno Award, the Canadian Grammy, Governor General's Performing Arts Lifetime Achievement, Order of Canada, honorary degrees, etc. So you have to carry that.
Yeah, and I don't feel like that's what it is. In the beginning, it sure felt that way because I struggled so much with I didn't feel like I had earned any of it. The early years, I'd say the first 5 or 6 years of the career was, I don't think so. I don't think I'm a singer. I don't think I don't deserve this life. But from that point of, wait, why not? And how do I deal with this level of fear? Ilira is the word in Inuk, to be in a state of emotional fear. That's when the real I want this started to wake up, and discovering all this becomes this, oh my goodness, gotta share this. And it's a pleasure to share. It's not just a duty or a responsibility. It is, I love seeing the light come on in the eyes of the participants in these rooms when they believe they can.
You grew up in Arviat, the daughter of a Pentecostal minister, one of 7 kids. What were your parents' lives like as they grew up?
And that's part of that discovery piece. Realizing what we didn't know. Our generation of Inuit were the first to live our entire lives in the settlement. So I've never lived traditionally. My parents did. Their birth and formative years was on the land. Nunamutat is the word my mother uses to describe them. We're from the land. So their lives were tents and igloos. When we hear the word Eskimo and we imagine what that Eskimo's visual of the Eskimo is, that was my parents.
They were hunting.
They were hunting, fishing, living off the land. And so when you think how in one generation that life changed, and that generation was ours. All my life has been settlement life. I've only known that life, that community. So their life, I remember signing the record deal, and I knew in my heart of hearts, if I tell my parents, when I tell my parents I've signed a record deal, there's going to be 2 reactions. One's going to be, it's not like rock and roll, and the other's going to be, oh, you can't do that. That's a devil's music. And it was.
So your dad was like, oh, well, how did you ever get your hands on a guitar? Did he get his hands on a guitar?
Well, so as preacher's kids, participating meant we all were handed an instrument, and this is what you're going to do during services, during worship. So every sibling, with the exception of maybe one, but she's a lawyer, so we can let that go, played an instrument and sang. So we were all given an instrument. What do you want to try? I'll try the guitar. Okay, and what do you want to try? I want to try the piano. Okay. And actually, we all can play a little bit of everything. So sometimes we
But were you just, is it just hymns? You guys,
just hymns.
No Elvis Presley?
No. We were not allowed to listen to anything that wasn't gospel, with the exception of when the radio station is on during lunch, noon hour, and evening dinner and morning, you listen to whatever the radio is playing. But until you left your home and you were a young adult and you could make your own decisions, you could not listen to anything but gospel music. I remember moving to Ottawa before all this started, and I found a Mariah Carey CD. And I'm like 22, 23, living on my own job, and I buy this Mariah Carey CD. I threw it away the next day. I'm living in Ottawa. They're up in the north, and I still have this fear that, oh no, they're not going to be happy. So I threw it away. That's how strong that upbringing was with the influence of ministers and church in our lives.
One of the most powerful memories I have, really, even from my career, was being in a tent one time in Aglukark on the land with 5 generations of women in that tent. Tiny baby to the great grandmother who didn't speak English, but her granddaughter was translating. And you just thought, wow, what these people have seen. And again, the changes in lives.
Yeah, in a matter of a generation, literally, is when everything changed, everything shifted. There was no returning. That was my parents. We knew when we left it, we can't go back to any of that. In a generation, that changed.
And how has your mother coped with it, or as she sees these changes?
The way I describe it in the book is from igloos to apple pies. She makes the best apple pies in the world, and they embraced it. The book is called Kihiani, which in Akviet specific dialect translates to because we must. The Inuit always understood there's some things beyond our control. They are what they are. And I think our parents' generation were the generation who went through the greatest change and knew it's going to happen. Change is inevitable. And so they did incredible. Like my mother maybe has 2 or 3 days of formal education, if you can call it that. My dad had maybe grade 6 or grade 7. With that, they made incredible lives and built and raised 7 incredible children. We've all ended up in careers we love. So that generation went from Nuna, the land, to formal education, to long careers. My mom's still at almost 80. I think she's an academic level developer. She's just incredible. She's always reading and writing. She's self-taught. She has an honorary grade 12 diploma. Inuk is still her primary language, and she speaks enough English to have a conversation. That's Inuit from the land. They did incredible adapting in a generation.
One of the things that has been, such a part of your journey, and you've been very brave about it, is you're talking about being sexually abused as a child. You went to court, you testified before the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Inquiry. That took a lot of courage.
Thank you. I don't know that courage is the right word, because you're presented with situations, and I think every Indigenous artist has that story where we can never just engage in the dream life you're living. As an Indigenous person, 100% of us will always also be advocates. I say that 100% of the Indigenous community has trauma. So for the longest time, the next couple of generations, we are going to have to fight. So given these opportunities, we have to. So again, the book, Kihiani, we have to, because we must. The phrase is, we don't have a choice. if things are going to change and get better, and I believe they do, I live with hope. We have to engage. And so given those opportunities, and we've learned to live with, and thank God for the arts, triggers, we have to speak up. And that's just our reality right now, and will be for another generation or two.
You say when you moved to Ottawa, because you went to become sort of part of the civil service and stuff, get away from RVET at that time because of how difficult that was, but that you mentioned this, you were full of fear, just about everything in your life.
Yeah, everything. I think the best way, again, Inuk word, Inuk is such a powerful language, very concise, precise language. The word is to ilrasuk, emotional fear, a state of emotional fear, deferring always to the other person, who is almost always a white person, because that was our influence, our teachers, but it is never us. So that was me in Ottawa when I first moved there, which meant some days were worse than others. Those bad days, I would go to catch my bus to get to work, and sometimes I would feel something's a bit off with the driver, so I think I'm going to walk today, which was an hour walk to work, but I would rather walk than feel this ilra. And that was the first years of living in Ottawa and pursuing a career in the studio, songwriting, not because anyone there did anything, but we have that instilled in us. The environment we grew up in, this generation, the settlement generation, is that first generation of this state of ilra, deferring, institutionalized, and that was us.
How did you find your voice?
I didn't hear it as my voice, I'm going to say, until 2011 or 2012. Until then, and up to then, it was the preacher's kid's voice. I sang because I had to. I sang because it felt good. It was an outlet. To say I'm a singer didn't happen until 2011, 2012. And then it was like, you're good.
You are good.
You know? And good enough for me is where I needed to get to. I got there and I heard it. Okay, I think I hear what people hear now. So it took a long time for me to say, I found my voice.
And yet people, reading your story at the time, you were in your 20s, you had a record deal, you were starting making albums, very successful albums, you were outselling big artists. What have you outsold? You outsold Sting at one point.
Well, charts, yes. We knocked him down a notch. The charts. I don't know. I didn't outsell. I've actually. It's an odd story. I've sold a lot, but by industry standards, not enough. So it was never enough to say successful in that way, but definitely as an Indigenous artist, one of the top.
And you were saying people must have wondered at first, songs of yours were full of rage and anger, a song about your cousin, for example, Kathy, about suicide, they were heavy topics. They
were, and again, they had to be told. Between Arctic Rose and This Child, a lot of it was written in those two albums. And I really feel like with This Child especially, with Kathy I, what it was becoming about was I was coming to appreciate the power of expression. The more I wrote, the more I sang, the more I expressed what I was holding, the more I could release. And again, I didn't know that you could. This was just simply happening as it was happening. So a song like Kathy I wrote because how does it happen? How do we lose somebody so close to us? How do we let that happen? That's what was going on in the writing of the song Kathy I.
Well, it was your therapy, even though you weren't doing therapy.
Exactly.
Do you still suffer from stage fright?
Not anymore. Not
You know,
anymore.
got over Nelson Mandela, the Queen, the Prime Minister, all these fancy people you've sung for.
You know what I did to do that? I remember this one day, and I was just so tired. I was so tired of that Susan behind the curtains, Susan on stage, fear, ilera. And I was hiding behind the curtains, and I was like, maybe they won't find me. Maybe I don't have to do this concert. Maybe it'll go away. And I was like, why? You're look at what you have. After that, I started creating this process in my mind where when you cross over to the stage, I created her a Katarina. I named her a Katarina. For the next 2 hours, you're a Katarina.
Where'd you get that name?
I did. So one of the Olympics, watching on CBC, and it was a skater.
Katarina Witt?
Yeah.
Yeah, stunning.
Yeah. So I named this person, you're beautiful, you're talented, you can do this. Okay, I'm going to name you a Katarina, because right now Susan doesn't feel that. That's where I got it from.
Does she still exist, Katarina, or have you been able to let her go back to skating?
I let her go. Yeah, I let her go. It was, later on, it's like, okay, it's time to look at what you have.
But interesting, all those sort of, imposter syndrome or not worthy. I mean, that was also, you felt as a high school dropout, I'm not smart enough. Even though you'd come from this strong centered family, that you had all those doubts about yourself.
Well, and that's and it's not specific to Indigenous, that's the complexity of trauma. We know one trauma, we don't know the others, and we don't speak about all the other traumas, so they're compounded now. When I understood this,
but specifically what? Sexual assault, which was...
That and when we think of what was not available to us in terms of support, for example, my parents knew, but they didn't know how to support it, and that not supporting added to the trauma. Right, so we can trace this compounded, complex trauma that's happened to all of us who have experienced abuse of any form. So when I understood that, I could start to put it away. Understanding what was going on allowed me to release the anger in stages and bits and pieces and start to make room for loving it. And that was part of that whole, I found my voice. Voice is not just this, voice is this. I love the stage now. I have this platform, I'm going to use it, and becoming that instead.
And your husband and son have been important.
They're very, very important. I laugh because I had moved away, I moved to Toronto, I had decided I'm gonna just live the rest of my life alone. I want a child. I knew I was gonna have a child. I wanted to be alone. And of course, studio, and within months I meet the guy, and it's like, that's the guy. And it couldn't have been more perfect. Who he is, and him in the arts, and where I was at, and even now, where we are, we're going to be celebrating 30 years together. Couldn't have been better.
How do you straddle two worlds? Living in southern Ontario and spending time in the Arctic and the North?
I think what I brought with me to Ontario, which was, I don't feel like I'm any different today as an Inuk person had I stayed and spent my life in the North, or the other way around. I don't think as an Indigenous person, I wouldn't have been any different. I hope that makes sense. So when I go home, and I'm home a lot, the only thing that's different is that everybody knows me. But otherwise, I'm still just Susan. I'm still just their friend. I'm still just the person that, you run across the road to the neighbor's place, no invitation, just walk in the door and have a cup of tea. and they do that with me. Nothing's really changed. So I don't feel any less Inuk for being in Ontario longer than I've been in the North.
And you say home when you go north, so is the North is home?
The North is home, yeah. So that's Yellowknife, that's White Horse, or that's Nunavut, or Nain Labrador, or Greenland, actually.
And as you look forward, I mean, sometimes you think, how do you know, I talked about you straddling worlds, Ontario, and the world you inhabit in the North. You know, how do you see life going forward in the North, not being affected, changed, transformed utterly by just technology and how the world is going?
I think of my parents, and we were so fortunate, realizing in hindsight, we had access to the other generation, grandparents, and to a short period of time, great-grandparents. What I remember to this day about them is that they were compelled by their version of a beautiful life, a life of hope. So that has survived the generation. So in the work we do, we talk about the important distinction between community and environment. So community is intact because the thousands of years that our ancestors have occupied and built and lived their best lives in these places is the community. The struggle is the environment of crisis that resulted from the residential schools, the acts of colonization against generations of Inuit First Nations. That's the environment of crisis. The distinction is important to know, and we know the distinction. Community Namakdo, we're fine. We're intact. Inuit, we're Inuit. We still live our contemporary traditional Inuit life. It has survived, and it will continue. What we're working to heal from is the environment of crisis. The environment of crisis is not community. And that comes from the ancestors, parents, grandparents, bringing us up through and in spite of what they were going through while they were raising us in these communities. I think that is why we can still be our traditional contemporary selves in these communities, and will stay that way. It is strong. Change was inevitable. We knew that. But we haven't lost that fundamental traditional self in this transition. It has stayed intact, and I think it always will. As long as that stays intact, we're going to be fine as an Inuit people.
And the work you're doing with Arctic Rose Foundation and kids and arts and giving them a safe space, and maybe you say allowing them to dream, I mean, because they're confronting lots of trauma and suicide, and people know about all the troubles, and you're trying to do your best to counteract that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we feel is the strongest thing to leave, to wake up in them, is the dreamer. And so when we talk about dreamers in this room, what we understand as the artists, and we have a Blackfoot therapist that works with us, psychologist that works with us. What we understand in our work is we are re-engaging the dreamer. We start there, and then we nurture the dreamer. But we have to work with a believing, when they come to the room, what does it feel like to be a dreamer? That's what we're working on. That's where we start. And that's the state our children and youth are in when they come to the Arctic Rose Room.
And you're hands-on. This is not, I'm lending my name.
I'm hands-on. The program, Messy Book is what it's called, is a program I started developing years ago. And that's the program that is all arts and the process versus product approach. And I developed that because I've lived it. I've lived it. I get it. It works.
The final question we ask is, what does being Canadian mean to you?
So I touched on it a bit. When I think of what my ancestors did, to get here and to stay here. And all I could think is the power of hope. And if we can keep nurturing that and believing in that as a country, I'm that Canadian. As long as we can keep honoring this as Indigenous people, that's what being Canadian means to me, is always honoring that incredible journey Indigenous people did and do, respectively, to be in this country, to make this country what it is. As long as we see that and honor that, I'm that Canadian. That's what being a Canadian means to me.
Well, thank you, Susan. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the 63 Foundation, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Linwood Family Foundation, Jim and Sandy Treliving, the Browning Watt Foundation, Tony and Sherry Fell, Michael McCain and family, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Mary Davey, Clinch House Foundation, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Pilosoff, David and Cheryl Carr, the Sheila and David Wilson Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.